welcome to a very special Ewtn bookmark, at least for me, Doug Keck, as a person who loves old movies. An old friend, Mary Claire Kendall, is with us again, talking about two of her books, Oasis, Conversion Stories of Hollywood Legends, an update of her book from about 10 years ago, and her latest book, Oasis, The Souls Behind the Billboard, both available naturally through our Ewtn religious catalog, ewtnrc.com for all things Catholic. It's always great to see you.
Oh, good to see you.
How are you? And always excited, especially to talk about Hollywood legends and the movies. And not only are you writing these books, but you're actually helping us on a series that we're doing on the early days of Hollywood and the Catholic influences.
Mm-hmm. Yes. That is so important because you know, Hollywood is just such a powerful force, and there were some wonderful Catholic influences, either overt or just the directors, you know, the actors who had the Catholic sensibilities.
What do you think made, you talk about a conversion of Hollywood legends, and you've got Hitchcock and Cooper and Hope and you know, Wayne and people in here, and Miller. What makes a person a legend in your mind?
Well, certainly a grasp of the art and an ability to really, you know, stand out in terms of being able to communicate feelings and emotions and connect. And also, there's the legendary aspect of what I write about their lives and how they were able to rise above some real personal foibles. So I think both.
Right. Do you think one of the lessons that you get from these kinds of stories is not that this kind of, in a sense, it's not a Hollywood story in the sense that, oh, things are really tough, I suddenly find Christ or faith or religion and now everything's wonderful?
No, it's the opposite. It's more like, the Hollywood story. I mean, it's funny because when they wanted me to write, when I wrote about Gary Cooper and his conversion, I thought, oh, Hollywood will love this. I went to an LA magazine publisher and she said, oh no, we're more interested in his external life. So yeah, so they haven't. I think though they might be gradually coming on to the idea that there's something pretty exciting about the personal spiritual journey, and it's not Hollywood. It's you're down in the dumps. Betty Hutton was, you know, Skid Row, but she rose up and became. Well,
I know there's a quote in here from Betty Hutton. I think it's somewhere, and just indicating her own perspective about, at least at the time when she was in Hollywood, just that everybody's got problems.
Yes. And what happened with her, she was very religious. She was Lutheran background, but very spiritual. And when she got to Hollywood, she said, it kind of seeped out of me. And that's the problem, is the money and the fame, and then you lose your spiritual moorings, and then it's tough. And then, you know, and they do become have very difficult lives. And the drama, I think, is these stars who actually recovered didn't check out.
Yeah, because a lot of the stories you could read and you'd say, well, they go through it and, well, they had a conversion experience, but then they got married 2 more times or something else happened. And at the end of their lives, when the Grim Reaper becomes more obvious, they decide to get religion.
Yeah, but that's not the case with Mary Astor.
Right.
Because her personal journey with Barrymore, which is, but she had this personal journey with her upbringing. Her parents turned her into a cash cow. It's the personal journey, but her personal journey is amazing, and her conversion. And
Well, if anybody doesn't know who Mary Astor is, watch The Maltese Falcon. It's one of the greatest performances you'll ever see. As Miss Wonderlay, she was fantastic. Bridget Wonderlay, she was wonderful in that movie. Right, it's interesting, and she had a drinking problem.
And she had just converted to Catholicism.
Right, when she did that originally, right, around 1940 or something.
Her drinking problem became with her second husband, because he had bars all over the house, and that's when she really developed a drinking problem. But then she because of her personal, you know, escaping, she finally discovered it became a real problem, and finally she woke up one day and said, a sick person can get well, and went to Father Peter Sicklick, who had helped Spencer Tracy, who's in the second book.
Right, right. That we'll talk about
Yes.
after in that situation. The other story that in looking through this again, that one of them that jumped out at me was actually Ann Miller, and then you referenced Jane Withers.
Who I interviewed.
Okay. Josephine the plumber from the old commercials back in the 60s and the 70s.
Oh, I didn't know
Yeah, that was Jane Withers. Right.
Oh my!
Yeah, right.
No, I know her from Shirley Temple's
Yeah, right,
Bright Eyes
right.
sidekick.
Yeah, when she was a kid actor.
Yeah.
Right, right.
She was friends of a guy whose father was foundational to Hollywood's The Doctor to the Stars. That's how I.
Okay. So it was interesting to see.
But
'cause
Ann Miller, yeah.
So she related to Ann Miller
Yeah,
there.
and Ann Miller introduced her to her husband, yep.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting because it seemed like Ann Miller was somebody who was trying to do it the right way.
Yes.
And then, unfortunately, made some bad mistakes marriage-wise.
I know.
But I didn't know she was in a position. L.B. Mayer was in love with her.
Yeah, and she was like, oh, I mean, really. So she wasn't the. Often they marry for power. I don't want to say that, but it's just true. Yeah, she was really cute. She was like, and she was helping her mother who was blind, and she was darling. And she just didn't believe in the casting couch, and she knew from her knowing L.B. Mayer how real it was, and the calls, the women calling to him. But yeah, he wanted to marry her.
Yeah, because she was so different than the other actresses he had met.
Yeah,
right?
she was a breath of fresh air.
Isn't that interesting?
He almost committed suicide over it,
Yeah,
evidently.
right. You talk about that in the book. But it's interesting how you end up with that. They used to say in the old days was, well, girls, that's the kind of girl a guy will date but not marry.
Yeah.
But you could see out there that something like that happening. The other person who struck me too, which I wasn't as familiar with as well, was Ann Sothern.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, she was she was amazing. I mean, because this is what's in the new edition, that she did have spousal abuse, and she really suffered a lot. I think she's a saint. And she became a Catholic.
Right.
In the midst of all her suffering.
The other thing that as I guess one of the common themes you run into, I think, at some level, besides is abuse, is also kind of unspoken abortion.
Oh yeah.
In the sense of situations where people went for therapeutic help and
Mary Astor makes that point.
Right.
Her beautiful. You have to read her beautiful 1959 autobiography, I think My Story. She talks about that.
Right, exactly. In fact, I remember that Loretta Young, actually, in a Loretta Young theater, we aired it once. It was the story of an artist, a sculptor, who kept making this sculpture of a child, and it was actually a story about abortion, about somebody who had abortion who was trying to deal with that loss.
Oh, and Gloria Swanson, that famous story. I can't remember. She was in Japan or something. So there was a garden, I think, for. I can't remember the story, but
right. Yeah. We talk about her situation, her career, kind of ending up Sunset Boulevard being emblematic of kind of what her life was like.
Yeah.
Especially after Joe Kennedy dumped her.
The Kennedys, they were a chip off the old. Well, he was the block.
Right.
The
Yeah.
block.
Exactly. I think he was the one who showed the boys how it was supposed to be going on while Mom was playing the rosary.
Yeah.
Apparently.
Yeah, his sons, you can't really blame them too much because the formation that he gave them in that regard. Yeah.
So of the stories that you got involved with, and my impression from what you've said is that each story is your favorite while you're working on it.
Yeah.
But post facto, whose story was the most, at least in the first edition here we're talking about, was the most inspiring to you?
Oh, and I was gonna the most moving and inspiring. Betty Hutton, Gary Cooper for sure. For Gary Cooper, maybe he's at the top because of his.
Well, you have a relationship too with his
with
family.
Mary Cooper
right?
Janice.
Yeah,
She's written the foreword to this
right.
book coming out, which we'll talk about later.
Right.
Gary Cooper, Duke. Because you understand where they came from. You understand. I mean, Duke, his father was kind of timid, and his mother kind of was the powerful, and how he was treated. And then you just can't help but just fall in love with him. And Hitch was darling, and he was, and Bob Hope. amazing how he, same thing, his father was alcoholic, you know, he was a chip off the old block, and he just, amazing.
But in the closing years, I think because of his wife, I think there's a quote, Lucille Ball said the best thing that ever happened to Bob Hope was Dolores Hope. Right?
Yep.
And sometimes.
And she just was, Father Gershell said she was just a good Christian woman. And, you know, Dolores was, I ran into her at St. Matthew's in 1994, and she asked me to pray for Bob.
Yeah.
It was a stranger.
Right. We had a picture up, I can see it's Patricia Neal. You also talk about her. Now, she's buried at the Abbey.
Yes.
With Dolores Hart, who's now, of course, the mother, as we see in the picture there. And we actually did a mini-series on her, her wonderful book. And she wrote I think the foreword to this particular book.
Yes, Patricia Neal has a piece of my heart. They all have a piece of my heart, so I don't have a, yes, I know. Patricia Neal, she came from a pretty stable family, as did Gary Cooper, the rest of them, and Alfred Hitchcock, but no. Patricia Neal, absolutely stunning actress.
Right.
But had some real spousal issues after the stroke.
Right.
You know, they were both big career people. That's always tough.
Well, she kind of got kicked out by her husband, right? The famous author.
Yeah, Roald Dahl. I mean, she was initially the big success, and that was hard for him. That almost squelched the marriage, but they worked through it, and then he became, well, it's life.
That's I think what's good with this, again, is you don't want to sugarcoat it.
No.
You need to understand, again, that it's not this kind of Hollywood fairy tale.
No.
In fact, it's actually a Hollywood nightmare in many cases that these people go through. And as you can see from the book, many times it's either the fact that people are faced with their own eternity coming, or the fact that they've hit bottom.
Yeah.
And that's when they turn to the Lord. It's funny too, because you have the chapter 8 on Jane Wyman, and of course most people think, and you talk about it in relation to Ronald Reagan, in that situation. But of course, you know, one of her great performances was in The Lost Weekend with Ray Milland, and then of course Johnny Belinda, which was the one she won the Oscar for.
I ran into the nephew of the woman who came over from Roscommon, Ireland, to be her nanny. Every morning, she would leave at 6, and this was after, I think this is when they were having difficulty. She lost Christina.
This was Agnes, was her name Agnes or something?
Yes.
I think it was.
Where do you go?
Yeah. I go to Mass.
And that just, you know, that had to just really shoot through her. And then I think it was, and then they had the problem where she lost Christina, which women grieve in different ways, the baby. And that really, that put it on a difficult, and they did have the 2 careers too. That was the difficult one too. Right.
The other one, just quick before we go to the second book, the new book, Susan Hayward, From Brooklyn to the Bountiful. Only when I forgot to believe, when I failed to trust, that I despair and permit problems to overcome me. And then of course, it's so interesting because she played the great character in I Want to Live.
You can see that personal life came right into her performance. That was just stunning. Yeah.
She talks about the fact that I noted this with her childhood. It was interesting. She was hit by a car.
Yeah.
Okay, and you know, so she was in bad shape early in her life.
And then she got that sexy. Because they didn't have the money to have the traction. Yeah. Right.
So she had an interesting. But it's amazing that you read these stories, and I think they're probably enlightening for many people, and I think sometimes it would be good for younger people to read some of these stories, because I think we get confused by what we think we see, especially now on the internet and things like that. So
one point that they're suffering their lives, like A.C. Lyle said, Betty had great torments and great talents, and they all showed up on the screen. It was part of their artistry. It was how God used that.
Well, do you think that the suffering artist is in fact something that's actually true? That a lot of people are taking their pain and the issues and pouring that into their work, so to speak, right? Now, your second book is entitled what?
Oasis, The Souls Behind the Billboard, and I'll tell you about that.
Okay.
Well, my good friend Harry Flynn, who was publicist to Bob Hope and Michael Landon and Ernest Borgnine, read Oasis 1, and he said, "This is great. This is a great book. You just tell about the stars in a whole different way. You show the souls behind the billboard."
Right. So that's where the title came from. So who did you decide to focus? Was it mostly men or all men? It's not all men, right?
Well, because I did 8 men for Oasis 1, so this one I did 6 women, so 6 men.
Yeah, most of the
most women. Excuse me.
most women in the first one, right?
Most women. So now I've done 9 and 9.
Right. Was it easier to find women initially?
For when I was doing the conversions,
Yeah,
yes,
right, yeah,
yes,
right.
Betty Hutton, yes, they were mostly.
I mean, in a sense that women tend to be more religious or
Yes.
might turn to that in
Yes.
their own situation.
Yes, I think so. It just kind of, I don't know how, because I knew Maria Cooper, it just kind of fell into place. Maria Cooper Janis suggested I write about Mother Dolores, and then
Okay.
Patricia, it all kind of fell into place.
Okay.
Betty Hutton was the first one. So the second one, I'd already written about Ethel in the intro, so I wanted to expand her story.
Right.
And
Yeah. Now you've got some very interesting stories in here. Famous people: Cagney, Tracy, Stewart, who wasn't Catholic, but you also have Guinness, and he relates very well to a lot of younger people today, obviously because of the whole Star Wars
yeah.
thing. So probably of most of these people, they know Alec Guinness better than anybody.
Yeah, I know.
Obi-Wan Kenobi, right?
Funniest story about Alec
Right.
Guinness. This kid came up to him at some premiere, looked at him, he had like, "I've seen Star Wars 100 times," and he said, "Would you promise me one thing? Would you never see another airing of Star Wars?" And the kids went away crying.
He's like, why don't you watch some other great film?
Because he had such depth too.
Right.
He had such he understood the tawdry side of Hollywood. Like he talked about the Hollywood fleshpots, you know. So he came from England, and he was
And was it
amazing.
different? It strikes me that even today it's somewhat different, but certainly in the past, like a much more a smaller community, you know, Pinewood Studios or whatever were there,
yeah.
and not quite the level of star status
Yes.
that they got in the States.
Yes, he was like the pantomime artist. He was like the Charlie Chaplin of. I mean, he was just so brilliant.
Right. Oh, a lot of great. Our Man in Havana. But what was his conversion experience like?
Oh, amazing. So he was always looking for his father. Didn't know who his father was, actually, because his mother was on the Isle of Wight, and anyway, so who knows? So that's how he poured himself in. Acting was his salvation, and then in his 20s he was always looking for something solid, and he wanted to become a Catholic, but then didn't. And that was one of his regrets. He said, if I had become a Catholic early, it would have avoided a lot of problems.
Oh, interesting.
But then, no, he has a beautiful. So and then it was really, I don't want to give it away, but it was really when he was doing Father Brown.
Right, he was doing it, right.
And this little kid
He was
came.
playing a priest.
Yeah, this little kid came. Mon père. And it was like grabbing, and he thought to himself, some child who not even just has such a warm feeling towards a priest that these priests can't be all the reputations that they try in the bad press.
Right,
It can't
right.
be. It can't be true. And so that he turned, and his son was it's a
Right. You
so
got to
that-
read the book to
You
get
gotta
the
read
full,
the book.
to get the full story.
I'm kind of tongue-tied there.
Now you seem to be enamored of the Barrymores. Why?
Oh, because well, they're giants of
The great theater family,
theatrical
obviously,
giants,
right?
So Ethel and the Maurice came over, and so Maurice was this matinee idol, and then his wife Georgie, the mother and father of Ethel, Lionel, and John, and she became entranced with Madame Modjeska and became Catholic, and brought the children in the fold, and then got sick, and her husband was very much he wandered. He was
typical of his times in some ways.
Yes,
right,
and
unfortunately,
Ethel, and then she got sick. She got tuberculosis. She was a great actress. Oh,
right.
unbelievable. And then they went to Santa Barbara, and when they were parting Ethel and saying, Georgie was saying, please don't forget me, and Ethel that was the first time she really saw tragedy, and then she died, and then Ethel and then Maurice went crazy because he got syphilis. When he first came to New York, when he off the boat, he got syphilis, and it was a ticking time bomb.
Right back
but then Ethel had to she wanted to be a pianist, and then she just had to go into the acting, and she was such a stalwart. She really, I mean, she's a template of somebody who she did maintain her Catholicism, and then John was Catholic, but he had his problems.
Yeah, hanging out with Errol Flynn doesn't help.
Yeah, but he was John, and but he came full circle.
Right.
Lionel wrote his biography, wanted the world to know that he came back to the church. People thought that he was, done for. Now
so when Niven and Flynn stole his body, it was out of the, you know that story?
No, I don't.
Yeah, it's a famous story.
It rings a bell.
Yeah, but it was Errol Flynn and David Niven who did it.
Oh.
I think it's Niven who did it. I don't think it was Randolph Scott. He was with Cary Grant.
Oh.
So yeah, there's a famous story about that you can find on the web, I guess. Anyway,
okay.
Not to get off with that,
I'll
but
have to,
that's an interesting story. What about Jack Lemmon? I mean, he's kind of a more contemporary kind of star that people might be familiar with.
Yeah, now he's harder to get a read on, but he definitely he was definitely, well, his mother was not Catholic. And so his parents split, and one day he was asking his mother why she didn't go to church, because he went to church with his dad, and she says, "Well, I'm not Catholic." And so you could see it was very much part of his young soul. He had it was difficult with the parental friction, and but he definitely, I've gotten the read that he definitely did. You could, and there's a little snippet where he's out drinking with Christopher Plummer one night, and it's in the Jewish. It's in some articles. He's like, oh, I gotta go to church, and Plummer's like, but you're not Catholic. But he was. So he was just a quiet Catholic. And,
right. And yeah, it's interesting too with that kind of thing, like you said about the people who maybe they didn't overtly do it, or as one story you talk about, didn't darken the door necessarily, but their Catholicism was lived out in their work.
Yes, definitely. Now, Lemmon, was an alcoholic.
Right.
And so, yes.
Was that typecasting for Days of Wine and Roses then?
Well, they didn't know he was.
Was at the time,
They didn't know, because he was interviewing with the guy, James, inside the actor's studio.
Yeah,
James,
right. Yeah, I remember him. Yeah.
And they talking about that, and he said, well, and he announces, and he said, "You're not talking about your character. I'm talking about myself."
Yeah.
So he struggled because of his upbringing. It was, it's tough.
Well, that seemed to be. I mean, in reading through many of the stories in both books, you could see, obviously, at a time where drinking was even more typical and acceptable, and drinking to excess was probably more acceptable.
Yeah.
You had a lot of people who were obviously dealing with issues that you didn't know about because the fixers would take care of that, and there wasn't the social media information. You would get
And
much
also,
more control,
like
right?
Spencer Tracy was an alcoholic because he had hypoglycemia, just like F. Scott Fitzgerald. So it was an illness,
Right,
and they
okay.
didn't understand it at that time.
Right, how they had higher susceptibility to.
And they would
infecting,
just gloss over it, the fixers.
That's why they said Tracy was one take. Right? They said the best take he did was his first take.
Oh.
So of all the people, and you look at them between the two books, if you said, what's the one thread that runs through all of these stories in your mind, what would it be?
Well, when I was editing recently Oasis too, it seemed like I had a lot of subheadings. The turning point, the tragic turning. There's always a turning point. There's always where they have to come to terms with their human foibles, and because they're on this grand stage, this grand high.
Do you think sometimes with these, I'm just wondering, without being the junior psychologist here, you've got people, they know who they actually are. It's like the famous line about Cary Grant where somebody said to him, "I wish I could be Cary Grant." He said, "I wish I could be Cary Grant too." The idea that they know they're not who they're portraying or people believe them to be. And that gives them an incredible amount of insecurity and anxiety, right?
But actually, but they actually lose themselves and they find stability in
the
subsuming
characters.
themselves in
Right.
the character.
Right.
That's another,
Or even taking
another
on that,
side of it.
or even taking on that persona as a person.
Oh, Alec Guinness.
Right.
When they say when he'd be playing somebody like really nice, he'd be really nice. He'd be playing somebody like really nasty. He'd like he'd become really nasty. He just would take on the personality. Yeah.
Right. So you've got 2 books, all having to do with Hollywood. You've got another book coming out. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Hemingway's
Closing minute?
The Hemingway's Faith. Oh yeah, that one. So Hemingway was actually a Catholic convert, which most people don't know. The notion of Hemingway that he was a hedonist, misogynist, good writer, but really flawed. He was irreligious. Well, he was very flawed, as we all are, but he was very religious. He had a real devotion to Our Lady. And if you look at if you read his works, it's all hidden.
Right.
It's all there. His sister, Sonny, said that to understand my brother, you have to understand his spirituality. It's the foundation of everything he wrote.
Really?
And he loved, and again, he loved Mary, just loved Mary. And he thought that the church, if they would just focus on the apparitions, that was it.
Interesting.
That's the stamp to say this is the real deal.
Okay, so we can look forward to that book
Yes.
coming out later this year. But we've also got 2 wonderful books to consider as well.
Doug.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Mary Claire Kendall, Oasis, Conversion Stories of Hollywood Legends, of course, and Oasis, The Souls Behind the Billboard. You'll get some great insights in both books, available naturally through our EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com, for all things Catholic and for wonderful stories about great Hollywood stars. I really enjoyed both books. Check us out next time right here on Bookmark.